Topping news at 5, Iowa abortion laws. New information today from the Iowa Supreme Court. The ruling: abortions remain legal in Iowa up to 20 weeks of a woman expecting. The state Supreme Court declined to unblock a law that would have banned abortion when a fetal heartbeat can be detected around 6 weeks. The court deadlocked 3-3 on whether the law should be revived. Governor Kim Reynolds signed the fetal heartbeat bill into law in 2018, but a Polk County judge put a hold on it, and the following year, a judge ruled the law was unconstitutional. After the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade just last year, Governor Reynolds asked the court to lift that injunction, but a judge blocked that in December. So Governor Reynolds appealed to the Iowa Supreme Court. Today's decision from the court is largely procedural. The 2022 appeal to the 2019 ruling was too late, but that does not prevent Governor Kim Reynolds and lawmakers from passing a new law that looks the same. Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds says she's disappointed by the lack of decision by the Iowa Supreme Court. In a statement, Reynolds said, quote, "Not only does it disregard Iowa voters who elected representatives willing to stand up for the rights of unborn children, but it has sided with a single judge in a single county who struck down Iowa's legislation based on principles that now have been flat out rejected by the U.S. Supreme Court," end quote. And today's ruling keeps the status quo. But if there's one thing both sides can agree on, the fight is not over. The justices who voted to keep the current restriction said the legislature should pass a new law. Iowa Republican lawmakers, including Governor Kim Reynolds, suggested that was the next step. They could wait until January to do so, or they could call a special session this year to pass new legislation.
If the court is putting that responsibility back in the legislators' hands, I would be in support of that, as I know our organization would be. So if that's what the governor chooses, then of course we would support her and we would support that happening.
Planned Parenthood and the ACLU say if Governor Reynolds does call a special session, they still plan to push back against any new restrictions.
Whatever fight they put before us, we will certainly be ready to take on. We know that Iowans are firmly with us on this issue, the growing majority that supports safe and legal abortion.
Either Governor Reynolds or a supermajority of state lawmakers can move to call a special session. And with today's decision by the Iowa Supreme Court, as we mentioned, if you're just joining us, abortion remains legal up to 20 weeks of pregnancy in Iowa. Now, Nebraska's abortion law is slightly more restrictive. Last month, Nebraska lawmakers passed a bill that bans abortions after 12 weeks. The 12-week ban includes exceptions for rape, incest, and to save the life of the mother. Now, as for South Dakota, abortion is banned at any stage of a woman expecting. The only exception if the pregnancy threatens the life of the mother.